So welcome, my name is Ryan Moschel, and I'm here, the HANA Somatic Education Learning Community. I want to host today, and we're bringing in Amy Takaya. She'll be presenting Synthesizing Somatics through Podcasting. Amy is presenting on the project of Free Your Soma podcast and using podcasting as a platform to connect experts and visionaries from wide field of practice under the umbrella of somatics. So I knew Amy before I met her in person through her father. Her father used to tell me about her adventures throughout the world with her doing Bikram yoga, trying to convince her to come and do somatics. And she was ready when she was ready, which was good. I had the honor of being on the teaching team when she was coming through and when she graduated and finished her training in 2021. Her son Jonathan audited the modules by default and will hopefully be ready soon within the next decade or two. So it's good to have Jonathan on board. Amy just moved from California to Buffalo, New York. She, in my judgment, is a powerhouse in the field, a very kind soul, and we're glad that she is helping to get the word out. So without further ado, Amy Takaya, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I have a little, about me part of my presentation, and you already covered some of that. So that'll be nice to move through those things more swiftly and get to, the bigger matters. Today, my intention really is to share with you about the journey to create the podcast and the journey of creating Free Your Soma, which is my HANA Somatics based business. And also, I would like to encourage anybody who's out there who has been having visions or ideas or dreams of how they'd like to either be living or sharing their HANA somatic practice more widely, right, or more deeply, and has felt like there's something in the way. There's something in the way of them doing that. So I'm going to kind of be exploring what gets in the way of going after our dreams or making our visions into a reality, or what showed up for me and my process around creating this podcast and continuing to create this vision that I have. So I'll be sharing my screen in a moment. I have a presentation that I have prepared. Everybody see that okay?
We got it.
Okay, so let me go back to the front, the title here. So, Synthesizing Somatics through Podcasting and Releasing Internal Barriers and the Art of Going With, right? How I have been applying the HANA Somatic principles to not only my internal process, but also to the way that I run my podcast. And it's all kind of happened very intuitively. So it's kind of interesting to kind of go back and retrospectively see how things have occurred, and I'm going to kind of take you through a timeline. So first, I'm going to share with you a bit about my story, how I got here, how I got to having a somatic podcast. Then I'm also going to share with you about my somatic podcasting process that has evolved and kind of emerged throughout the last year and a half, 2 years. Then finally, I'm going to share with you kind of the future of Free Your Soma, the podcast, and other projects that I'm working on. So a little bit about my background, right? So as Ryan said, I started off as a hot yoga teacher. That was my first career, was Bikram yoga. Although I discovered or experienced Bikram yoga at the same time that I actually first experienced HANA Somatic education in 2008, because my father was in the training in 2008 and did his first hands-on session with me at that time. Now, I was not particularly interested in slow, gentle micro movements. I was more interested in doing intense back bends and, rigorous exercise. And that was just so much more appealing to me. I thought that somatics at the time was slow and boring, and I just wasn't interested, right? So I spent 5 years as a professional world traveling Bikram yoga teacher. I traveled all over the world and I taught and practiced very intensely. And during that time, I ended up in a lot of pain. And I started having a bit of an identity crisis, because here I was, this bendy, impressive yoga teacher traveling all over the world, living this dream life. And yet what I was experiencing in my body and internally was a lot of frustration and pain. I was experiencing feeling split and not knowing how to bring myself back together, and not finding that freedom from pain in my yoga practice, unfortunately, right? So after 5 years and, most of that time living honestly in chronic pain, I came back to the United States to care for my aging grandmother and to be with my family. And during that time, I started going to the HANA Somatic educator training and beginning that path and that journey. During that time, I also got married and had a baby. And I was still teaching yoga, and I ended up doing a couple other yoga trainings during that time as well. But I couldn't really see how HANA Somatic education would ever be more than a side gig for me, because I was used to having this whole, community of Bikram yoga that was global, and it was, very well known, and it was this franchise. And so I could understand how I could easily make that into a career, but I really didn't see at that time how I could make HANA Somatic education into a career, right? I didn't have that organizational power or notoriety of hot yoga to work with. And then kind of along this journey and this path, in 2001, in the spring, I finally recommitted, I guess you could say, to a daily practice of my cat stretch series, a daily practice of my movements, because for a long time I had been struggling to maintain a daily practice, but I got very committed to doing that. And that ended up opening things up for me, obviously in my body, but also in other layers of my consciousness. And by August 2021, I had gotten this kind of crazy idea that I would open an Etsy shop to sell vintage clothes. And it's funny because I look back on that, deciding I'm going to do this thing, planning the whole thing out, building a brand, and then executing it, getting all the clothes, taking pictures of them, having fun modeling them, and then listing them on Etsy. And I opened that shop in August of 2021. And it was this accomplishment. It was this thing that I got through the process of the difficulty in the beginning, which I'm going to talk about more, right? The difficulty of starting something up and making something happen. And I experienced some relative success with that. So that was kind of this first foray into I can actually do and create a brand on my own and build something and execute it and take it all the way, right? During this time, I got back on social media, which I had completely been off social media during the pandemic for my mental health. But I got back on to sell vintage clothes, right? So I was on my Instagram again, and I kept seeing all these posts from another traveling yoga teacher who had become an online business coach. And she kept saying in her posts and in her the things she was sharing, that you can be everything that you are. You can be everything that you are, your whole person, and create an online business that's going to support you and that's going to support a larger vision that you have for the world. And I found this incredibly inspiring. So I founded in the winter of that year, 2021, I founded Free Your Soma, which became my business. And I decided that I was going to go full force. I was going to commit to going full force with my HANA Somatics practice. This was going to become my new career versus just this idea that it was a side gig, right? So flash forward a little further to May 2022, I launched a 6-month immersive personalized education program, which is called Radiance. By October of that same year, I decided that I was going to start a podcast. This was from inspiration from other people that I had been interacting with who also had podcasts. I had been invited to share my story and share about HANA Somatics on a few podcasts. And I was like, you know what? I love having great conversations. Maybe I should do this, right? And then by January 2023, I launched Free Your Soma podcast. By October of that year, I actually executed another one of my big dreams, which was to have a HANA Somatics based retreat, in-person retreat, 3-4 day retreat. And I did that at the Mount Baldy Zen Center in California, right in October of 2023. And by the winter of last year, this is 2023 last year, I was recording episodes for season 2 of the podcast. Now, here we are at March 2024. I'm right about to launch a 9-week somatic movement adventure. So it's another online program that will initiate people in HANA somatic movement and sharing my specific way of sharing this information with people, my specific imprint, my specific style, gets to have a voice through that program. So this is all like, I look back on this and I'm like, wow, like this is so amazing. I did all this stuff. But the thing is that there were things that were getting in my way, right? Like before I recommitted to my daily practice, I had this belief that I couldn't make Hannah somatic education into a full-blown business. I just couldn't see how I could do that, how that was possible for me, right? That was a belief that was getting in my way. And so I'm going to kind of ask that question right now. What gets in the way? What gets in the way of these ideas and these visions that we have for ourselves, for our lives, maybe for our business, right? Because in this process of accomplishing all that I've accomplished in the last 2 years, I've continuously had to work through and work with what's getting in my way, right? So I'm going to kind of go through some of the things, especially around the podcast, because for me, that was a big step forward. That was a big, like putting myself out there into the whole internet, into the whole ether and being publicly seen. And a lot of things came up that needed to be released and integrated, right? So the things that I needed to release and that I continue to need to release in order to make the podcast work, in order for this to be a viable thing that I'm consistent with and that I'm doing, right? When we release things, as you guys know, in your Hannah somatic practice, we don't just do it once and then it's done. We have to do it over and over again because there's more and more things that come up from our unconscious that have to be sorted through, right? They're asking to be released. So things I had to release are having the perfect plan, right? And combined with thinking that I know exactly what to do. So in a way, that's kind of like saying perfectionism, that I have to already know all of the things and have the perfect plan. I had to keep releasing this idea that there was a perfect plan and that I should have it and that I should know all these things, right? Because otherwise I probably wouldn't get anything done. I'd just be continuously working on creating that perfect plan and it would never be perfect enough, right? And I would never know all of the things there is to know about podcasting or about creating a brand, right? I had to let go of feeling ready. There were plenty of times when I first was recording these episodes that I would hop on Zoom after having whatever was going on in my life and I would get ready to have an interview and I would not feel ready. I would not feel ready for that interview. I would feel like, oh, I need space or I need time or I should have done more somatics or maybe I should have eaten more food or eaten less food. There was this feeling of not being ready that I experienced a lot, but I had to release and let go of this idea that I had to be ready in order to do something, right? I had to release judgments about my voice, which is strange because I get feedback all the time that people love my voice. But for me, when I would hear myself on a recording, and this is me most of my life, like even in high school, I would kind of like cringe at the sound of my own voice for some reason. It felt so uncomfortable to hear myself. But that was something I just had to keep releasing and letting go, was that there's nothing wrong with my voice. My voice is exactly as it's meant to be. And I also had to get over this idea that if I said filler words, that there was something wrong with that, or that that I had to keep letting go of this idea that I couldn't just speak naturally how I speak, in my generational tone or whatever. So I had to kind of keep releasing judgments about my conversational skills, right? And the way that I sound. I had to keep releasing this idea that I'm not qualified. Like, who am I to have a podcast? Because if I'm perfectly frank with you guys, I don't really listen to that many podcasts. I really haven't. That's not really ever been my thing. I've heard one or two podcasts, but it's not something that I regularly do. So I would have questions about, who are you to start a podcast if you don't even listen to podcasts? If that hasn't even ever been a thing for you, right? Like, what makes you like a podcast person? And so I just had to keep releasing all of these different things that were getting in the way of me actually doing something. And I had to just show up and start doing it, right? And in the doing, which is what I'm going to talk about now, there's a lot of things that start emerging as you just go ahead and start something from this place of feeling a little bit disoriented and like you don't know what you're doing, right? So what developed in me as a result of doing, right? And it is in the action I found that I find my readiness. It's in starting to do it that I find the readiness and the willingness to do it. I had to trust this concept. This is something from the I Ching. If you guys are familiar with that, it's sort of one of these laws of reality. I had to trust that it will be difficult in the beginning, that's just how it works. Almost anything that we do in life, there is difficulty in the beginning. because it's the beginning and we're a bit disoriented and we don't exactly know what's going to happen or what we're going to do because it's the beginning of something and we may not have any neural pathways for that activity or prior experience, right? And so actually learning to trust that it's a little bit difficult in the beginning and that that's in a strange way kind of reliable and that it's just the beginning of something and that's why it's feeling difficult. And that if I continue to do it, it will slowly get easier and easier. Just like we do with our pendiculations and our movements. Sometimes with a client or with ourselves, there may be sensory motor amnesia and difficulty in the beginning of a movement or action pattern. And then as you repeat it, as you do it again, it becomes a little bit easier and a little bit easier as you get oriented and connected to that space in your body, right? What also developed in me was an ability to stay present in my conversations because I was continually releasing and letting go of these judgments and thoughts and worries that were in my head. And as I continued to practice letting those go in the moment, I became much more present and available to the person in front of me that I was having the interview or the conversation with. Right. And I found that this is an incredible skill that has developed in me through podcasting that has vibrated out into all the other relationships and conversations and communications in my life. It's just I'm a lot more able to stay present because I'm practicing getting out of my head and into the present moment on a regular basis. I developed a natural somatic way of conducting interviews, which I didn't intend on doing, but is, I think, a natural result of living in a more somatic way, doing my regular somatic movements, is that I just start to be a more somatic human. And so my podcasting and my style ends up becoming, reflective of that. I also developed a real sincere desire to hold space for stories that need to be shared and for people to really feel comfortable sharing those stories. I felt this real sense of that I was doing something important when I would set up an interview with someone and I would invite them to share a part of their journey or a part of their story from their somatic experience in life. And it became this, I guess, deep place of honor that I started cultivating in myself for having that space and having that availability, for having this platform to do that. So ultimately, my podcast has become an extension of my personal and professional somatic practice. And so now I'm going to share with you a little bit about the podcast and some of the things that I got to experience and that people I got to interview in the first year of podcasting. And then also some of the things that are, coming up. So I ended up realizing this in retrospect. I developed this going with style of communication in my interviews with people, meaning that I would accommodate them and I would include their knowledge bases, whatever knowledge base they were coming from. I would try to see how it connected to the HANA somatic principles or to other somatic practices. Like, how do these things go together? How do they go with each other as opposed to opposition, right? Or how do they compete? Instead, how do they go with? I would invite guests sometimes who didn't use the word somatic at all. Like I would go see somebody's website or I would encounter somebody online or in person, and they would be talking to me about what they're up to. And I would think, wow, like this is really somatic. Like this is a really somatic person who is like doing somatic work, but they didn't have that nomenclature. They didn't even know what somatic meant. And so that it was this beautiful opportunity for me to invite them into this whole realm of somatics and offer them this new language and this new framework to start to see themselves in a new way, to start to see what they were up to in a new way. I also got to share HANA somatic education with guests and an audience that may have never heard of it before. I ended up learning that even within the realm of somatic practices, HANA somatic education is very unknown. And there's a lot of people out there who are somatic practitioners of varying kinds who have never heard of HANA somatics and don't even know that you can make the kind of changes to your motor cortex and to your muscular system that we make in HANA somatics. So I ended up feeling a bit sometimes like an ambassador for this work, going out there and informing and sharing with other somatic practitioners what HANA somatics is. So I have a picture here of my interview with Rachel Ray Halder, who is an incredible somatic practitioner. I love this interview. I can't wait for it to come out. Hasn't come out yet. Definitely recommend listening to it. And she had never heard of HANA somatics prior to our interview. So there was an opportunity there for us to engage about it and for her to get a little bit of an idea of what's possible from an HSE perspective. I also would intentionally invite folks from a wide variety of backgrounds and knowledge in order to create more of this synthesis. So sometimes I would invite people, like I said, who didn't know what somatic meant, or they didn't see how necessarily what they were doing in the world was somatic. But to me, it was important to have this conversation because they were in a field of study or a field of knowledge that to me was body-based, to me was something that we could fit under this umbrella of somatics. So sometimes I would be very creative and inviting certain guests on to talk about things through this somatic lens that maybe they weren't even familiar with. And that's been quite fun. I would also allow the conversation generally to be guest led. So I would say, hey, what is it that you want to share? What is it that you want to talk about? And then I would go with them and I would, gently kind of tie in things from what I know and from, the realm of knowledge that I come from to what they were talking about. So again, this idea of going with them rather than sort of me being in the control space and this is how the interview's going, I would let them lead me. And then if they would get disoriented and lost, or if they would kind of like not know, what they were saying, I would pick up on that and I would guide them very gently kind of back to the original intention for the interview or the original thing that they had expressed that they wanted to say. And so I ended up kind of feeling sometimes like I was working with them almost as a client, like I would with a client, guiding them back into, a movement pattern or back into what we're here to do through this very gentle approach, but ultimately really letting them take the lead and guiding them and following along. So some of my season 1 guests, I have a kind of a little smattering here of the different people that I interviewed, which was really fun. My biggest kind of like celebrity or accomplishment was that I reached out to the 5 times best-selling author and nutritional healing doctor, Dr. Joel Fuhrman, and I asked him if he would come on the podcast to talk about, some experiences that, people have around food and the shifts and changes that people go through when they start eating a more whole foods, plant-based diet. So that was really fun. He was super approachable and friendly and literally gave me his phone number and was texting with me. I was surprised at how easy it was to get him to come on my podcast. I also interviewed a sound healer who works with a very specific frequency, and he had a lot of really fascinating niche knowledge about this specific frequency called A432 hertz. And we got to really explore that from a somatic perspective because he's also a yoga teacher. So he had a little bit to say about, these frequencies affect our bodies. I also interviewed an astrologer, right? You can see kind of the wide variety of folks that I'm interviewing who speaks about somatics. I had been on her Patreon and listening, and she had dropped the word somatic a few different times talking about hermetic wisdom, or this idea that as above, so below, as within, so without. And so we had a very long, it's I think an hour and 40-minute podcast where she's really going into kind of the somatics of astrology, which I thought was super cool. I interviewed a former model. She was on America's Top Model. She's turned now into a coach, and she tells a very interesting story of moving from growing up in a conservative Christian household to having accepted or normalized or embraced her disruptive female archetype, which she called, a witch of all trades. So it's kind of interesting journey or path that a person goes, in their transformation from where they started off in life to where they ended up. I also got to interview a gentle parenting coach and advocate who's also an influencer online, makes a lot of really great, funny videos on TikTok and Instagram, and she shares from, a somatic perspective, the benefits of gentle parenting. I interviewed a professor and a yoga teacher who wrote a book on surviving her childhood living in a cult, and also a variety of everyday folks and my own clients who have been through some kind of somatic awakening. So sometimes I invite people on the podcast who really never been on a podcast before. They're just there to tell their story because they think their story is important, and I think their story is important, and we need to let people know that you can transform your life, that you can change your inner reality on a physical level as well. So I've loved having a way to invite someone into a dialogue about somatics that's fun, stimulating, and can be shared with others, right? When I meet a really interesting person now, I have this, instead of just being like, hey, I just want to talk to you. Can we sit and have coffee? I can be like, come on my podcast. And I have this lovely format to be able to have those really wonderful conversations. So the other thing that I've been able to do on my podcast is amplify other HANA somatic educators and share their knowledge and experience. And I intend to do that more. And it's kind of an open call right now. If you feel like you want to come on the podcast, I've invited a few of you who are here. Ryan and I still need to book an interview sometime, but you're very welcome to come on if you have a specific thing or story or perspective that you'd like to share. Some of the people who were on season 1, I had Danny Burke. He came on. He was my first HANA somatic educator guest, and he was sharing on the connections for him between somatics, HANA somatics, and whole food plant-based living, the way that he chooses to eat. I had Brian Siddhartha Engel of Living Somatics come on and really dive deep into what it means to be self-healing. Right. I even had my cousin, who is also a HANA somatic educator, come on and share his story and his journey through HANA somatic education and men's work. And this is really fun. I had Don St. John, who found me. He reached out to me through like a podcasting service where a third party reaches out to book a podcast for a person. And so I got an email like that saying, hey, this guy, Don St. John, would be a great guest for your podcast. So I booked him. And when we hopped on the call, the first thing he said to me before we started recording was, I just discovered you're a HANA somatic educator, and I did the training with Tom in 1990. And it turns out he was from Wave 1. And I was just tickled. I thought that was so fun that I got to have this really cool conversation with someone who really knows what HANA somatics is and worked with Thomas Hanna and had that perspective. So that was very fun. And then now in season 2, one of the first episodes of season 2 in January was with Dr. Gabriel Posner, sharing about his research projects around somatics. I've already recorded a few different episodes for season 2 that haven't been released, as I mentioned before. Martha Kassler, we recorded an episode together for her sharing her personal story and also the way that she synthesizes HANA somatic education with her other healing practices. And I have an episode coming out next month with Lawrence Gold, where he's really taking somatics, beyond just pain relief and into these really powerful quantum realms. So I'm very excited to share his perspective as well. I do intend also to interview my father, who, came. I'm not sure if he's still here, but he came today, about his way of catalyzing the journeys of many people in his life and also his family into function and growth, not only through HANA somatic education, but through the men's work that he has also been involved in for a long time. Because I think that'll be a really interesting conversation, and that people might be fascinated to listen to a father and a daughter talk about these things together and have this kind of connection that has taken a lot of hard work and had to move through a lot of strife to get there. So I'm excited to continue to share this podcast in a professional and a personal way. In terms of the future of Free Your Soma, right, like all the things that I'm up to, the podcast, creating retreats and events, I have a commitment now at this point for the last 2 years of continuing to share somatics and continuing to share HANA somatics with the world. So some of the ways that commitment looks is that I'm committed to showing up and creating a space for collaboration rather than competition, not only with other somatic professionals, but even within the realms of HANA somatic educators. I'd like to see us really come together to support each other and to amplify each other's work and to really get this message out there more and more, because there aren't enough of us in the world, and people need to know that this is an option and that they can experience the kind of things that we know, are possible. The other things that I'm doing, I did 3 festivals last year, and I've kind of decided on the festival that I really liked the most, Joshua Tree Music Festival. I'll be presenting there and doing a presentation on creating freedom from pain. It's going to be kind of a philosophical as well as a practical presentation. And I'll be doing hands-on AHSE in the Healing Oasis at that festival in May. I'm also going to continue to develop online programs that offer my style, my imprint, and my specific transmission of HSE into the world and into the realm of somatics. I'm creating retreats. I'm going to do another 3-day retreat in May, and creating this is a fun term, it's micro festivals. So you can create like a little mini festival, that's maybe 2 days long, where you get a bunch of practitioners together and you sell tickets to, your local community, and you create a space where people can come in and try different somatic practices and also have fun, have, delicious food and, a playful environment to explore being in Soma. So I'd like to be creating more opportunities for in-person fun events like that to take place that will feature and highlight HANA somatic education, but also connect it with other somatic practices. In general, staying consistent with my podcast episodes. I recorded a whole bunch because I knew that I was moving to Buffalo and I needed to have some money in the bank, some podcast episodes to trickle out over the next few months. But it is my intention to continue to stay consistent. And that has sometimes meant hiring help as I've needed to do some of the administrative stuff around the podcast that I might not have time for. I'm also trusting that I will continue to grow as I follow my somatic inklings and stay present. And a big part of that is maintaining my daily personal practice of HANA somatic movement. For many years, I would kind of spot treat, meaning that I would, do a long session of somatics with myself only when my body was screaming at me or in pain. But what I've realized over the years is that the consistency of releasing the mental, emotional, and spiritual stress that life creates in us it's important to do that daily, whether or not your body is in pain, right? So for me, I'm continuing to be committed to a regular practice that addresses releasing on all levels of my consciousness, even when my body's feeling okay, right? And doesn't need a release right now. There's some other part of me that may need to process or let something go. So HANA somatic education, right? And one of the biggest principles that I've taken away with it, and this is from many conversations with Eleanor as I struggled, to kind of reconcile my previous yoga experience with the things that I was learning in HANA somatics that sometimes seemed contrary to what I had learned in yoga, right? But what I ultimately have discovered is that HANA somatic education is meant to go with everything in our lives. It's meant to go with other modalities. It's meant to go with weightlifting. It's meant to go with rock climbing or other kinds of yoga. It's not meant to be in opposition to those things because it's a natural part of our nervous system functioning, right? And this is HANA somatic education is a system that has been created around this natural truth in our bodies. And so it's meant to go with our lives as human beings. And Free Your Soma, my business, is dedicated to finding ways to educate and demonstrate this truth that this pendiculation thing goes with every other thing that we experience in our bodies. And that's my presentation. You can visit freeyoursoma.com to learn about upcoming events, retreats, connect to the podcast, and learn more about ongoing projects. And if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast or you want to reach out to me for some advice about, a project that you're working on, I'm very open to communicating and collaborating.